Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a little bit of a niche video. It's going to be a data preview, and I think we're going to be looking at team data and player data as well, particularly, projected data as well from our friend ELEVENIFY. If you haven't seen his content for the Euros, it's amazing. All the sort of data that I'm going to be sharing for this video has been taken directly off his latest projections. So this will be subject to change. There's obviously 3 to 4 days left until the Euro starts. I've also had a look at, for example, some of the betting data, some of the lines as well, just seeing to make sure that the projections make sense. And actually, all the team numbers are very, very close to market. So I'm very confident anyways with ELEVENIFY's data. I think he's a great modeler, and also he's done player projected data as well. And I think the nice thing about using his player projected data is that even though I have some disagreements with the current player projected data for some certain players, it's still better than using, for example, some of the market projected data that we have, because betting markets usually assume that players will play, for example, 90 minutes. So the lines that you get are obviously a little bit too aggressive for players who you might think have uncertain minutes. For example, a good example of this might be someone like Arda Güler, who might not have guaranteed minutes in Turkey yet in terms of playing 90 minutes a game, and is a bit of a differential, obviously, if you can get his minutes right. As far as Gundogan, for example, I think clearly playing a little bit more of an advanced position, he's more prone to being an earlier substitute. So you might have disagreements, of course, on his projected data and things like that. So let's just quickly jump into the team attacking data first. And the most important thing and the most sort of rule of thumb that I can give for this video is that I am looking at specifically match days 1 and match day 2 only, because I'm assuming that most players, at least 95% of players, will be using a chip on match day 3, which means that you don't really have to care about match day 3 until we get there. And of course, I'll be making videos to support you guys then. But the whole idea, of course, is that there are two dominant chip strategies, at least in terms of how you have to conceptualize your draft. Either you're making a draft for match day 1 entirely for match day 1, or you're creating a draft for match day 1 that targets both match day 1 and match day 2, because you only realistically have 2 transfers to really address your team in match day 1. So you still have to get the team right, and you can't just create a team that's just trying to free hit match day 1 whilst having it survive match day 2 as well. You kind of want to think about both fixtures and both sort of match days, with an equal amount of thought, with the idea, of course, that maybe you can have 1 or 2 players that can be punts in match day 1 that you can transfer out to a match day 2 punt. Anyways, let's just get into the team attacking data. The most interesting about the team attacking data that you can see here is that for match days 1 and match day 2, so for the people who are wildcarding on match day 5, this is relevant for you. What I would say is that Germany, England, and Portugal seem to be just the best teams when it comes to how we visualize their attack. However, France is rather high up as well. And the most key point that I'll say about France is that, despite them having a relatively tougher group, right? They have Netherlands, for example, in match day 2. But I would say France are one of the bigger, most dominant teams that I think we expect to be favorites in the tournament. However, we have much better projections and understanding of their attack than their defense. So what I would say is, obviously you have an attacking asset like Theo Hernandez as a defender, but be outside of that, for example, just in terms of the clean sheet side of things, there is a bit of a gulf between France as an attacking team versus France as a defensive team, and how they're evaluated by, for example, projection models and also, for example, betting markets. So I do find it quite interesting that it seems like Germany, England, Portugal are favored. Belgium is also really high up there as well. And I think the interesting thing is that Italy and Spain are still high up there. So it shows, first of all, despite Spain actually facing Croatia and Italy, so therefore not Albania, Albania has been excluded, Spain is actually relatively high up in terms of the goal projection side of things when it comes to team goals, despite the easiest fixture being excluded from this graphic. So I actually think that it seems like a lot of people are rating Spain very highly as an attacking team. And of course, that calls out to certain attacking assets, like, for example, a Lamine Yamal. Or, of course, if you can get access to Pedri, if he's going to be released in the game anytime soon, he could be an interesting player as well. Rodri, he is the penalty taker for Spain, but outside of that, of course, you're expecting really Rodri's source of points to come from ball recoveries and man of the match, as opposed to anything else. As far as Italy, it clearly shows you the impact of, getting to face Albania once, and how, of course, that distorts things. Because I would say, obviously, Italy, the team that they have now, for example, the team that they're bringing to this tournament, I don't think the expectations for Italy can be that high, if I'm being honest. Compared to some of the teams, for example, like Germany, England, and Portugal, I do think there's a big gulf, but you can see that the projected goals for the game versus Albania is very promising. And I think you can use the same sort of logic to evaluate a team like Croatia as well. The other teams that I think are interesting from a match day 1, match day 2 point of view are teams like, for example, Czech Republic, Austria, Serbia, and even Scotland to an extent, where their attacking data actually seems to be still, first of all, better than the defensive data. And then second of all, it just shows you that for Czech Republic, Austria, and Serbia, those could be some avenues for a match day 2 punt of sorts, particularly if you have the opportunity to just move into one of their players, maybe even a defender and attacking sort of fullback. You can evaluate them as an interesting option for match day 2, most certainly. Whereas obviously a team like Denmark or even Turkey, you're looking at them exclusively as match day 1 punts. So if you actually include, for example, let's say a Danish midfielder into your team or a Turkish midfielder into your team like Çalhanoğlu, then you actually probably need to consider the idea that they need to be transferred out in match day 2. So if you want to punt for match day 1, that you want to still, for example, make use of a wildcard 5 or wildcard match day 5 draft, you probably need to also keep in mind that they have to be transferred out on match day 2 so that you can sort of maximize the value and the fixture play here. So that's something that I think is quite interesting. And that's all I'll say about the sort of goal scoring side of things. One thing I'll mention too is a lot of people are quite high on, for example, someone like Benjamin Sesko. Obviously, it makes sense. He's a very well-touted prospect in football, but you can see, of course, even, for example, with Georgia, even teams like, for example, Slovakia, Slovenia, Hungary as well, where Szoboszlai is a very popular pick. Unfortunately, of course, the estimations for these teams are not particularly good. So you're really looking for these teams to overperform within a specific match, do well within one match, and then, of course, have their key player do well, like Kvaratskhelia, like a Szoboszlai, etc. So that's something that's interesting, but also keep in mind, of course, it shows the gulf, I suppose, in teams' international play as well. In terms of just specifically targeting for goal scoring odds for match day 1, I think the only thing that I'll say that is a substantial difference is you see Netherlands a lot higher up here in the standings, and same with, once again, Denmark and Turkey. I already called out Denmark and Turkey as interesting picks because you can evaluate them as your punts for match day 1, and then you can move into other picks in match day 2, because, for example, Çalhanoğlu, as I said, Eriksson, these are players at cheaper price points where you can easily move to another player match day 2. The one thing about Netherlands, though, I think is it's tough right now, because if Frimpong, for example, plays in attacking position, maybe even takes that right wing spot, maybe you can argue that, for example, someone like Xavi Simons is going to have a little bit of a tougher time getting into the squad, or at least there's going to be a little bit more rotation expected within the attacking elements of that Dutch team. So even though they actually seem to be very good for the match day 1 punt, you do have to make sure that you're getting the right player in your team from Netherlands. And I think maybe the way to access this sort of attacking dividend is, of course, going for someone like Frimpong in a match day 1, if you can guarantee that he starts and that he starts in right wing, because I think he would be a very good punt. Otherwise, I don't think the data here is really too different from, for example, how we evaluated match day 1 and match day 2. Keep in mind, of course, Italy is extremely high here just because they fortunately get to face Albania in match day 1. So it once again speaks to the idea that if you're taking a match day 1 punt, they're probably the best team to target, at least to triple up on, if you're going to go with that sort of triple or rather like double chip strategy within the group stage. And moving on quickly towards the player level data, we now have the forwards for match day 1 and match day 2. So what I've done, of course, is taken, once again, the data for match day 1 and match day 2, combined it, and we're looking at the totals now. What I do think is interesting is sort of evaluating the different price points within the game. So first of all, with Mbappe and Kane, what's interesting is that clearly there's a gigantic gulf between Mbappe and anyone else that's not Mbappe. So for me, the idea that Mbappe is the most template pick in the tournament isn't surprising. I do think that he kind of feels like a lock, and given the fact that you get to potentially captain Mbappe at least once in the group stage, probably twice, of course, you're looking at just an amazing pick that I think it's very hard to go without. With Kane, I think there's actually an argument to be had about whether we should keep Kane within our teams, particularly if you do have a chance to go Ronaldo and you're guaranteed or you're assured about Ronaldo's minutes. Because keep in mind, of course, I think the doubt around Ronaldo is whether his minutes are perfect, right? If you're expecting Ronaldo, for example, to play 2 games, 90 minutes each for match day 1 and match day 2, I think these numbers could actually go even higher, because what I noticed from ElevenIFY's numbers is that there was a little bit of a sort of pricing in of Goncalo Ramos's minutes, which obviously impact, for example, Ronaldo's total projections. So one thing that's interesting, of course, is if you're confident in Ronaldo's minutes, I do think that the idea of taking Kane out of your team is something that should be considered by most managers. With Lukaku and Griezmann, this is interesting. You can see Lukaku actually does dwarf Griezmann's numbers. And I'll also add an additional point where Lukaku, maybe you can argue that Griezmann is a little bit more quintessential, right, to this French team. Maybe he's more closer to things like ball recoveries, man of the match, which is definitely something that's not captured here. But Lukaku is much more goal dominant than Griezmann, and obviously just the nature of goals and versus assists in any fantasy game is that goals give you more points. So that's something that I think is worth looking into when we talk about goal involvement. Some of the players here are a little bit more assist dominant. Some of the players here are much more goal dominant. And I think the center forward, if you use a sort of very conventional logic here, the center forward is usually assumed to have much more goal share than, let's say, a winger, for example, who's going to probably have a higher amount of assist share. And that's just something to think about when you think about looking at the total numbers here. Try to keep that sort of context in play. Havertz is an interesting pick here at 7.5. I think he clearly appears as one of the best value plays within this tournament. However, the question, of course, is when you look at how good some of the forwards are, the question really is whether you're willing to be prepared to drop any of these dominant forces, right? Lukaku, if you suddenly drop him for Havertz, it does make sense. But the question is, do you have enough value within the midfield to really justify losing out in terms of the overall strength of Lukaku as a pick within the forward position? I think the argument, once again, in this situation is comparing Lukaku or Griezmann, for example, to equivalent sort of 9 million rated midfielders and asking yourself the question of whether those 9 million rated midfielders can actually outscore them if you go for Havertz in your team. Havertz, as I said, though, is a very good play for match days 1 and match day 2. What's really nice about Havertz, too, is that Nagelsmann effectively confirmed that Havertz is going to start as the center forward and be the number 1 center forward for Germany. Now, I don't think that his opinion is going to change on Havertz anytime within the tournament. However, of course, do keep an open mind to the idea that Germany can have early substitution. So that can have an impact on Havertz as well, and maybe that's priced in within Elevenify's player projection numbers, because as you can see, Fulkrug actually has really high player projected numbers, and this is actually even, I assume, anticipating that he's going to be a substitute for Havertz. Part of this could also be the idea of penalty share, maybe being towards, let's say, Gundogan's side of things when it comes to Havertz and Gundogan being on the field, whereas maybe if Fulkrug's on the field, we think that he is probably the dominant penalty taker. Although, in my opinion, I really think that penalties are a little bit murky. I do think Havertz and Fulkrug could very well claim penalties over Gundogan, and we'll see what happens, of course, during the tournament if we ever get to see a German penalty. But I do think, as I said here, Havertz does still strike as an extreme value play. Is he better than Lukaku, I think, is the question to ask. And in my opinion, he's not. But keep in mind, of course, there's a 1.5 million price gap there. Lewandowski obviously appears as a very overpriced asset. And even though Poland had a great result recently versus Ukraine, I will also sort of provide that the asterisk 100% is that Ukraine were fielding a completely unchanged backline, even though, of course, Poland were playing without Lewandowski. As far as Chiesa, he actually appears as, once again, a great value play. And I'll also point out Scamacca at 7 million as well. A little bit low on this list, but I think it's also because not everyone is guaranteed on the idea that Scamacca is going to start match days 1 and match day 2. So, of course, if you think that Scamacca will start match day 1, I do think that his player projection and his sort of goal share will definitely go up a lot higher than he appears now. Of course, it really comes down to your interpretation of his minutes. However, with Chiesa, you can already see an advanced sort of forward player for Italy and what the value play of that is versus Albania. And even though, of course, the tougher matches in match day 2, of course, you can look at Chiesa as a little bit of a punt in match day 1 because, for example, at 7.5, you'd still expect slightly better numbers than, for example, Havertz. If you can guarantee that, for example, Scamacca starts in match day 1, he might even be a better value play for the purposes of targeting that sort of chip strategy. And then I think the other points to call out here are, for example, at the 7 million price point, I do think that Doku's very interesting as a pick. Clearly, of course, if you can guarantee Doku's minutes, Belgium, of course, are a team to target. Once again, the question begs, though, is whether you think that you should spend less money in the forward position versus the midfield position. And we'll go into the midfielders shortly after this. Dovbyk is another interesting 7.5 pick. I think you can just see that Ukraine clearly have very stable games, but I don't think we're also expecting, going back to, for example, the team goal graphic, we're not expecting Ukraine to absolutely light the world alight here in the group stage when it comes to the attacking side of things. Although, of course, we can see a shocker, a stunner. Czech Republic as well with Schick is interesting. Some of the other picks that I think are interesting might be Sesko, Benjamin Sesko as well. He's not included in this graphic here, unfortunately, because the numbers really aren't high enough for him. I know a lot of people are interested in the idea of going for him because they kind of see him as a talisman, and that's fine. Lamine Yamal, I think, is interesting, and Dusan Tadic as well at 6.5, right? These are options who actually have better, for example, projected numbers than some of the other 8.5 million players in the game. Even, for example, Yamal over Morata is interesting, although I will mention that Yamal is probably a little bit more assist dominant than Morata, who, of course, is probably going to be a little bit more goal dominant. However, it just shows you that, for example, some of the extremely overpriced picks in the game clearly are Rafael Leao because we can't get his minutes right, Morata because the fixtures are tough, at least in the beginning. Morata can obviously be an option later on in the tournament. Giroud is a little bit overpriced. Dembele for sure. Arnautovic arguably as well. Højlund as well. These sorts of picks probably, if you want to take a differential, I'd probably take some of the players like at least a Tadic or a Yamal because they give you the enabling price point and they also have some better projected numbers than some of the other players as well. And I think even when going towards the tournament here, I think these numbers generally look right. As I said, Havertz, you could argue that his numbers could go higher based on your expectation of his minutes. Outside of that, I think you can argue that Scamacca's numbers are a little bit low, and therefore you can also conceivably take, for example, Case's numbers as a little bit of a baseline for what good Scamacca minutes might be versus Albania, and therefore sort of look at that as an option to punt for match day one. And just filtering for match day one, the only really impact that I would say, of course, is once again what stands out is Chiesa. Definitely Fulkrug, of course, as I said, being a little bit high, but nothing really too exceptional other than maybe, let's say, if you can get, for example, someone like maybe Depay, right? I suppose he could be an interesting differential, but I still think that it's a little bit of a stretch going back to it, right? Clearly, you can see that, first of all, I think with Depay, because he hasn't played too much football too, I'm not sure he's going to be guaranteed 90 minutes of football on match day one. He could be an early substitution, which he has been in recent memory. And outside of that, unfortunately, I don't think there are too many great value plays. It's really about whether you can get the Italian forward right if you're taking that sort of double chip strategy element in the group stage as part of your consideration. Moving on quickly towards the midfielders, we're looking at once again match days 1 and match day 2 together. What I would actually mention here, of course, is that De Bruyne and Fernandes immediately pop out as standout picks, and so does Gundogan. These are three players that have actually recently all sort of featured within my latest draft, and to no surprise, I can see that they're very high up in the numbers here. Part of this too, as I said, going back to it, is when you compare, let's say, a De Bruyne or Fernandes to, for example, some of their respective peers in the game here from England, with Foden, with Saka, with even other German midfielders, like, for example, Wirtz, Gundogan and Musiala. I think the biggest thing, of course, is the expectation of minutes could be quite low for some of those midfielders compared to the two talismans here in De Bruyne and Fernandes. Now, of course, there are big dominant strikers for both teams as well, right? You have Lukaku and Ronaldo, who can definitely take the man of the match away, but arguably still, De Bruyne is still Belgium's most important player. The same could be said for Fernandes as well for Portugal, at least this iteration of Portugal. And I think it's fair to show as well, when you go back to the team goal numbers, that these are teams that still rate very highly. So it makes sense that these players who are much more crucial for their teams than, let's say, for example, a Foden or Bellingham, individually, for example, you can kind of see that De Bruyne and Fernandes, I think, are the best value plays within the midfield. And going back to, for example, some of the projected numbers versus the forwards, this is where you can definitely make the argument that you can maybe pass up on, let's say, a Lukaku if you can, for example, take the value play of a Havertz or a Yamal once again, and you can get and sort of max out with these midfielders, because of course the midfielders get more access to goal points as well. And maybe if you'd like to make the traditional argument that in UEFA games most of the man of matches go towards midfielders, you could apply a little bit of tax there as well. One thing I'll mention too that I think is interesting is Shaqiri is exceptionally high up, right? Probably the best value play here at 6.5. And to be honest, as I already said within my latest draft video, I am Spanish and I have Rodri in my draft. But when I look at numbers like this, it's very hard to pass up the idea of going for Shaqiri. What I could, I suppose, make as an excuse is that Rodri, of course, is a ball recovery merchant, and that's great. And of course, he might even have access to man of the match. I also am sort of looking forward keenly towards Pedri from Spain to kind of see what his numbers would be, because I think that Pedri will definitely start for Spain. And if you want to take a punt on a Spanish midfielder, if he's well priced, I think he actually would probably be the one that I could go for as well, ultimately. But I think, once again, Shaqiri for match days 1 and match day 2, because of the pair of Switzerland being so good, definitely is a great value play. Even Trossard, I think, is reasonably well priced, because with Wirtz, I think one of the concerns is, how are you going to triple up on Germany? Are you going to double up on the German midfield, or are you going to double up on the German defense? Maybe you're not going triple Germany, but I think it clearly shows that Germany are valuable and pretty price efficient, at least in the midfield position. And unfortunately, players like Saka and Foden, maybe not so much. I could argue that maybe Saka's numbers feel a little bit low, if I'm just being completely honest. Maybe this is something that we can obviously think about. Saka at least is cheaper than Foden and Bellingham, but clearly Foden and Bellingham's numbers seem a little bit higher than Saka's respectively. Although one thing I'll probably mention is that Foden's minutes might not necessarily be nailed, right? I think Foden could be an earlier substitution than, let's say, the likes of Saka. However, of course, we're already starting to see that Palmer is providing quite a lot of threat in terms of that position, and we don't also know 100% Saka's sort of availability in terms of, whether he's able to go all out for 90 minutes a game like we saw earlier in the season, compared to, let's say, near the end of the season where he didn't even feature in game week 38, for example, for Arsenal. So clearly there must be some sort of minutes impacts for Saka as well, alongside maybe just an estimation that Saka isn't so pivotal to this English team. At least historically, from what I can say, is that I think maybe I disagree with this just intuitively, but something to think about, right? If you're already with Saka in your draft and considering dropping him. Çalhanoğlu once again appears as an incredible value play. And I think what's nice about Çalhanoğlu too is that he does feature for this Turkish team. So if you kind of like that match day one punt, it does seem like a Turkish midfielder could be really good value. One player that's not actually listed here, probably once again because the expected minutes doubts, is Arda Güler, where I think he could be an interesting pick, particularly, a valuable pick, given that we actually think that Turkey could do quite well from the attacking point of view in match day one. So if you kind of like the idea of Çalhanoğlu as a pick, it doesn't really mean that Güler would be a bad option either. I think even though he doesn't feature here, he's definitely one to consider. Musiala definitely a little bit overpriced, and I would say the same with players like Kroos and Modric, unfortunately still. Obviously, Kroos and Modric being on all sorts of set pieces is lovely, and you can even argue that there's definitely strong man of the match potential for these sorts of players. But I still think that you might want to pass up on these options from a fantasy perspective, just because, once again, Kroos, going back to the point, is you probably still want to max out on the most efficient use of triple Germany. I probably wouldn't go for Kroos for that. Gundogan playing in such an advanced position, I think, is very tempting to play with, even if his minutes can be reduced, because as you can see, he still appears as a great value play, although maybe you can argue that his minutes might be a little bit overstated if you want to make that argument. With Eriksen, once again, I think he's also a very interesting value pick. And Szoboszlai as well, to be fair, but probably not as high as a lot of people would have expected. And I think it goes back to, when we evaluate, let's say, teams like Georgia and Hungary with Kvaratskhelia and Szoboszlai respectively, it does seem to be the case that, of course, once you sort of contextualize, for example, those team goals being split back into these talismans here, that the numbers still aren't going to be particularly high, although they still are definitely going to be great match day one options. And going to match day one and filtering for that specifically, you can kind of see that bear out, right? Eriksen definitely appears a lot higher on this list. Çalhanoğlu is ridiculously high up on this list as well. And even Kvaratskhelia is quite high when it comes down to it. Szoboszlai a little bit lower, but I think you can also put down that Szoboszlai is also very, very good at ball recoveries. And you can argue that the Hungarian sort of manager has also mentioned that he will play a much freer role within the system. And so maybe when we're trying to project Szoboszlai, that change in tactical element of Szoboszlai can be a little bit of an X factor as well. We can see the same for Eriksen too, when he plays much more advanced for his national team compared to, let's say, the sort of deeper, more controlling role that he plays for Man United domestically. I think you can definitely apply that argument to Szoboszlai, which will be interesting, right? So him and Eriksen are definitely ones to look at from that sort of pretext. As far as Shaqiri, I still think, incredible value, but Çalhanoğlu actually appears as a little bit better of a match day one option. It does speak to, once again, the idea that Turkey and Denmark are definitely teams to target if you're going for specifically that sort of double chip strategy application on the group stage. And now quickly, we're going to move on to the defensive data. The defensive data, I'm going to first look at clean sheet odds for match days 1 and match day 2 before moving on to match day 1 specifically. What I will mention once again is that when you look at match day 1 and match day 2, you combine everything together. I think a lot of people are going to be shocked that to find Ukraine and Switzerland so far up on these lists, right? Ukraine and Switzerland both have great games for match day 1 and match day 2. There are a lot of value picks within these teams, specifically within the defenders, right? We have Konoplia, for example, at 4.5 in the defensive position. If we can get the goalkeeper right, it's either Trubin or Lunin. I do think it's Lunin, but we'll have to just see basically if the manager can ever give that confirmation for Ukraine. But that's really good value as well. Other defenders could be interesting for Ukraine, but I think those are the two picks that I'm most interested in. With Switzerland, I think Fabian Schär at 4.5 is great. Yes, of course, Akanji's 5 million, but you'd want to spend the additional 0.5 million on Akanji, I don't really know. I'd much rather save the money with Fabian Schär. Sommer's also 5 million, but once again, you can save a little bit of money and go for example, Fabian Schär. When it goes back to England, for example, Pickford is 5 million. Sommer is 5 million. So I think what's interesting too is Belgium's keeper, Casteels, is 5 million. So when it comes down to pricing as well, definitely I think the value play is in the German defense, where you have someone like Mittelstadt, who should very well start match day 1, but we will find out the German lineup anyways. And then when it comes to Belgium, there's a lot of value picks here. We have Faes. We have also a left back who is not even in the game, De Kuiper as well. He's going to be an interesting one because Munier has a small little injury, and we have other injuries in the squad that probably mean that De Kuiper is nailed for both match day 1 and match day 2. At least this is my thoughts, because you saw him as an immediate sub in the second friendly for Belgium, and he started the first game. So I think that his position in the team looks relatively set in stone, and I think that's very, very fortunate. So if we head into the tournament, double Belgium defense isn't actually a bad value play. But going back to, for example, the midfielders and the forwards, there's so much value to be gained from Lukaku and De Bruyne. I think the only way that you can actually justify maybe going double Belgian defense is if you go for someone like Kai Havertz instead, and then back the double Belgian defense, which I probably wouldn't want to do. I think just historically, I'm not that keen, I suppose, on doubling up on Belgian defense. I do like the talismans that they have for their team. That's how I would sort of build my team, and that's how I've built my latest draft anyways. Here, clearly, you can see that we have some great options. And Wout Faes, of course, at 4 million, if he starts as well, which I don't think is set in stone, to be honest. We have players like Vertonghen, a couple other center backs within that Belgian team that can definitely start, or at least start one of the 2 fixtures, which is a problem. Going back to it, though, other teams that I think are interesting to look at here is Portugal and France are probably a little bit lower than most people would expect. Portugal and France, we saw when it came to the goal scoring side of things, we saw them and we've evaluated them as much better teams. France, of course, have to face Netherlands in match day 2. Portugal actually have a relatively easy group, but you can see that the clean sheet numbers here, the projected numbers, aren't great for Portugal. And I think that does call into question whether a lot of people want to continue with the sort of idea of going for the double Portuguese defense, which I've seen. Even though it feels intuitively nice, I think, to triple up on Portugal, I still think the idea that if you're passing up on Ronaldo, you don't necessarily need to triple up on this team. I think, yes, of course, you can go for Cancelo, who's very attacking, and he'll sort of circumvent the lack of clean sheet, I suppose, percentage here. The same thing can be argued for Theo Hernandez, right? These are both players who are very, very attacking, very crucial to what their national teams will look like, in my opinion. Theo Hernandez probably a little bit less so, because we haven't really seen the same sort of attacking extent as he has, for example, played when he plays for AC Milan as one of their key playmakers. But going back to it, I think that's the only way you can sort of circumvent the lack of clean sheet odds here for Portugal and France, despite us probably regarding them as overall, one of the top 3-4 teams within the tournament. So that's interesting to look at. Another thing to look at too is that Italy, Croatia, those clean sheet numbers are absolutely outrageous, right? When it comes down to it, despite them actually being in the quote-unquote group of death, it seems like, of course, just simply playing Albania once will actually just shoot your clean sheet numbers basically up into the sort of top 5, top 6 of the tournament here, at least within the group stages and from a match day 1 draft building perspective. So what I really like, I think, from a strategical perspective is maybe if you go for someone like DeMarco within your draft in match day 1, you save 0.5 million within your team. You can easily pivot DeMarco to someone like Josko Guardiola in match day 2, and I think that could be an interesting and excellent value play as well, because of course we only have 2 free transfers for match day 2. You probably actually want to exercise at least 1 punt within your team. And if your punt can be an Italian defender, moving from DeMarco to Guardiola, I think, is just excellent. And you could apply, of course, once again, the same argument with, let's say, a Danish attacking defender as well. Someone like Mela, if you think that he'll actually start in match day 1, which I think is most likely going to happen. He's sort of being rested because he's suffered from an injury, but should still start for match day 1 for Denmark. Moving him on to Guardiola is another sort of example of a really good value play. Czech Republic and Serbia as well, you can argue, also have really good match day 2 fixtures. So those are players that you can look at as well as cheap options from those teams. Netherlands, you can argue that there may be a match day 1 punt, but I probably wouldn't be too interested in Netherlands outside of Frimpong or Van Dijk, right? You probably don't want to go for Bruggen, in my opinion, because I think from a goalkeeping point of view, the clean sheets percentages are very low. However, the idea of going for an attacking defender, one player, for example, like Virgil van Dijk, who could be on penalties and, of course, is a great set-piece threat, and Frimpong, of course, who would easily play right wing, I do like that value play where you can move from that player in match day 1 to someone like Guardiola in match day 2, and I think that is interesting. Specifically looking at match day 1 perspective only for clean sheets, you'll find that actually Italy, of course, rank supreme, Denmark as well, Netherlands as well. Those are the teams really to call out on, where they're not necessarily pairs, and they're teams that you just want to go for and target if you're going for that chip strategy that I mentioned, where you're just using limitless and the wild card within match day 2 and match day 3 respectively. So if you're doing that, clearly, of course, the idea here is to target a little bit more Denmark than you would target Netherlands for sure, and probably go for Italy. On the flip side, of course, if you're someone who's actually not going for this strategy, if you're saving your wild card like me for match day 5, or at least that's how I plan right now, that probably means that you kind of have to have less players from these teams and probably take them into account a little bit less. But that's interesting, right? So I think overall, what are the learning points from this video? I think definitely if you're pursuing the sort of all-out attack strategy within the group stages, clearly the teams to target are Denmark, particularly on the defensive side as well as offense. Turkey, definitely from the offensive side, definitely an option to consider. On top of that too, I think Netherlands for sure when it comes to someone like Frimpong. I think he's an excellent play. Forwards a little bit too expensive in my opinion to really consider for the Netherlands. As far as people who are pursuing that wildcard 5 strategy, I think the value defense is definitely coming from Ukraine, Switzerland for sure, and then also just making sure that you actually have the right setup when it comes to, let's say, how you're tripling up on Germany, how you might be able to save money on certain players, like for example Mittelstadt, like for example a Jonathan Tah, and maybe go for Gundogan as well. Cheaper options, of course, that can still give you the right minutes and the right sort of value when it comes to also bearing out in the goal projections and the clean sheets, and also for example how you sort of maximize around England, Belgium, so on and so forth. So that's my thoughts in terms of the data preview. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. A little bit of a longer one, but I hope that this actually gives you a little bit of a holistic understanding of how to build your match day 1 draft from a data perspective, and sort of what my thoughts are. Definitely, of course, I have some disagreements with some of the player projected data, but that's something that will always be subject to change. ElevenIFY's numbers on his site are going to be updated as well, closer towards the tournament, and I'm looking forward to the tournament to starting as well. A couple more friendlies left to go that can maybe give us a little bit more insights on teams and players. I plan to do a predicted lineups video as well very, very shortly. If you have any other sort of video suggestions for the Euros before the tournament starts, do let me know. I will also upload a final draft as well if I feel the need to do so. Otherwise, take care and goodbye, and enjoy this week before the Euro starts.